And when you start to load it through transition, is you'd be pushing in the opposite direction. So from the toe, you're trying to get all that weight into your heel, and then as this guy straightens, and then all of a sudden, that's how the pelvis would turn.
Right, Dennis, so when we're looking at the movement of the lower body in transition and then through the golf ball, we have often heard a term called banking of what that trail foot is doing with the professional golfer, which is very different to also another term that we often hear, which is this old spinning out with that back foot. And sometimes we see a lot of players, especially if their pelvis is really behind at the moment of impact, this massive Disco Dave look where this right side's thrown out, they've got no room. And it's tough to hit the golf ball well from that position, isn't it?
Yes.
So as a general reference throughout the swing with the professional golfer, we would see that their legs would start a distance apart.
Yes.
At the top of the swing, they would get somewhat narrow. They would then spread again, and then through impact, they would start to narrow up again.
Yes.
Talked about why that is such and why that is an important element when it comes to creating a well-sequenced and proficient golf swing.
Yeah, so from about P4, which would be the top of the backswing, to P5, would be very similar to jumping.
Okay.
So if I wanted to create maximum jump, I would be using my arms to help what I call the lower body, the legs, to have some energy, and then I would have that extension piece that starts to come into the equation. So when we're starting to look at the flexion extension piece of it, right? So we are set up in flexion. We've got to get some extension to get a little bit lighter so that we can kind of sit back down, so we can have these legs working like a little bit like a piston. So I can start to add some energy into the ground, and then there's your ground reaction forces. Like the body has to do something. Like the ground ain't making that thing move, right? It's like, come on, right? So the body needs to work in a certain manner so that we can become proficient then in the ground reaction force stuff. Okay. So one of the first things that we'd be looking for is some vertical forces. But to create vertical forces, it'd be hard if I'm going to try to jump by just
keeping up.
It's not enough, right? So this sensation of trying to stretch and then to sit back down to pump some energy into that trail leg, so that when I start to get back into that sit down, I can now push. So I'd want to try to create a little bit of a hot spot underneath that ball of that right foot when I start to come back down, so that I can push going towards the target.
In that direction.
I can add some slide.
And we'll talk about some of the longest players out there, and this is very much contradicting what a lot of amateur golfers believe of keep the knees locked in and turn the upper body against the lower body. That's going to create a consistency. We don't want any resistance in our golf swing, right? A, you're going to hurt yourself. And B, you're not going to have a well sequenced or a powerful golf swing. You look at any of the world's top players, longest drivers, they will have a full movement of their body where they would tend to get an extension and a rising of their body, a sitting and a compression, and then that full explosive energy coming back down through the ball. And that's exactly what you're detailing there.
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. So I just want you to talk a little bit more now of if a player is, when they are looking at their golf swing, they see that their back foot is trailing, what are they doing which is encouraging that?
One of the first things we'd have to understand is that we need some slide. Okay. So when you start to look at the center of the pelvis from the face on camera, so if you did that again at the top, so there's a reflexing that you were doing, right? But then you're also not sliding, you were just fully churning. Right? So there it is right there. So the pelvis is actually worked, the center of the pelvis is worked away from the target. We would need a little bit of what I would call kind of backing in.
Okay.
Think of a pitcher. They're kind of falling towards the target. So there's a little bit of linear motion that we need as we're sitting back in, so that we can create a hot spot on that foot, because at the top of the backswing, we've kind of pushed more pressure into the heel, so I've got to create that little hot spot. There you go. So as you're sliding a little bit forward, you're reflexing that knee, and you'll start to feel a little bit of a hot spot right there. And that's what allows you to be able to jump. So it'd be like lateral bounding. Like, so I've got a lateral bound this way. I've got to create a hot spot off of the ball of that foot to help me push. But at the same time, I can't. If I'm going to try to jump real hard, I don't want to start static. I'd get a little bounce in my step. So that's what happens from like P4 to P5.5, that sit down piece. I've got to get that bounce back in my step. Because from the top, like I can't push because I get a little bit more pressure into the heel. So I've got to get this ankle and knee to reflex again so I can create that hot spot as I'm kind of backing into the target, and then all of a sudden I can start to kind of apply more stretching. Because technically our hips don't churn. We can churn our hip line, but in terms of the ball and socket joint, there's really nothing in there that would churn the hip. So I'm trying to churn my hip line, and I'm going to churn the hip line by the articulation in the knees and ankles. That makes it a lot easier for a lot of people. And specifically as we get older, like I'm 48 now, stuff that I could do in my 20s with my feet square, you know, back then to what I'm doing now, I can't get into a really nice follow through because I mean it hurts. So as we get older, we lose some range of motion. So again, kind of gets into churning the feet out, which people think of the feet, but it's more churning the femurs out to change the ball and socket joint inside the hip socket. And it makes it a lot easier. It's freer to churn.
And I can feel when I do that, it also enables very much so, especially with this trail foot. We're going to talk about the front foot a little bit later on in another video, but with this trail foot, if I get this trail foot turned out, and it's specifically the femur as you were talking about, that also encourages this sensation or this falling motion back towards the target at the same time as facilitating that extra bit of rotation with this trail hip moving back. So like for most amateur golfers, right, the recreational golfer who's got a full-time job, office worker, let's say they might have a little bit of mobility issue through the hip flexors. Just getting the feeling of getting this turned out more actually is a great starting point if you are a player who tends to have this look spinning out.
Feet too square,
exactly. Absolutely. Because you can see that this heel is actually leading that motion and shifting out in that direction. Whereas if we get our toe turned out, what that enables us to do, and that whole right leg turned out, is to almost get that real feeling that we're shifting pressure into the ball of the foot. And I'm in a really good situation here with this right foot. It just feels powerful.
It's grounded, right? It's easier. Again, the lateral bounding pieces. Again, trying to be more of an athlete swinging the golf club. When you look at other professional sports, when they're trying to guard something, nobody's sitting here like this, right? Their feet are a little bit more turned out. You have a little bit more articulation to the knees and ankles. You have more freedom of movement to be able to move in any which direction that we need to, versus sitting here. Right? So I think it's an important piece. But also, when you start to look at that, that would be one of the first things we start to look at. Another video would be the combat early extension.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's say the first step for players who are finding that they are getting this back foot spinning out, the pelvis is shifting back at the moment of impact, would be to simply ensure that with this right leg here for the right hander, that as they are turning it out, it's not just the foot, it's the right kneecap, it's the right femur.
The kneecap has to turn out. You'd have to feel it up in the femur, up and in the ball and socket. That would be a big one.
Fantastic. Okay, so now I'm in this position here. Let's say a sensation now in the downswing here, Dennis. What should I be looking for?
So I would say this, right? So you'd get to the backswing. You'd be trying to feel a little bit, right? So you kind of feel a little bit more on the pressure on the ball of that left foot, right? So you'd want to feel like the left knee would be moving over the toe as you'd be pushing into me a little bit more. And then we'd always want to feel like the hip, right, doesn't get too far outside of the knee. Because now all of a sudden, if you sit right here and you try to do a squat with weight, you can't, right? So you've shut off the ground. So we'd always have to make sure, right? So as you're transitioning, you're trying to feel that you're starting from the ground up, the sequencing, that when you would always try to feel like the knee is a little bit more outside of that hip socket, right? That would be the anatomy. Now from here, you can feel like, all right, now I can sit here and I can really post up on that leg. If you were to do that again, you let this left knee kick in too hard, and then you start with your pelvis, you can already start. That's also another reason why people will be on that back foot.
I won't be bounding around.
I can't, right? So if I kept going pressure, it would buckle. And that's where athletes start to blow ACLs and MCLs. So the relationship between the knee and the hip to the ankle is really important, specific to if you're trying to get off that trail foot.
So now we're talking about the importance of having this lead leg pushed out or rotated out in such a way that helps facilitate that
Yes.
movement of the kneecap. Great references almost feel like the kneecap is kind of going over the ball of the foot on the same line as you've kind of got it set out. And that'll give you a guide. And as a result of doing so, that slows down the rate in which really we would see this pelvis turn relative to the golf club.
Yes.
Which is key.
Yes.
Because there are so many players out there that, let's say, the typical model would be this is turned too much in, there is a form of resistance, they don't create enough rotation, and then straight off the bat, they think they need to rotate.
To try to get open.
To try and get open, to try and get that look, to try and shallow the shaft. But unfortunately, when you're in this position here, no matter how good you are with your hands, life is tough.
You're in trouble.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
life is tough. So
yes.
we're going to get both feet turned out.
Yes.
I would like to, I suppose, use analogies to say, feel like you're a duck
Yeah.
setting up to it. Both kneecaps are turning out. That helps me get into a position where I can get this trail leg extending, nice centered pivot. Then as I'm falling down, because my lead foot is flared out, now my kneecap is working down over the ball of the foot. The arms, as a result of doing so, are naturally unloading underneath.
Yes.
And then from here, because golf is an athletic, dynamic movement, and that shift and recentering of pressure, the ground then pushes back, it allows you to naturally explode up.
And it's a nice position of the foot, and when you start to load it through transition, is you'd be pushing in the opposite direction. So from the toe, you're trying to get all that weight into your heel, and then as this guy straightens, he moves that trail hip back and around. And then the trail foot keeps pushing forward, and then all of a sudden, that's how the pelvis would turn. Or you could say the hip line would turn.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got a little disc down here on the ground here. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so these are like normal furniture sliders, right? With the younger kids, I kind of call it a little bit more the zombie walk, right? So it would be this sensation of learning how to squeeze those inner thighs together. And you see that with a lot of really good ball strikers. Again, it aids in the banking, and then the pelvic tilts, right? So that we don't see any space.
Yeah.
So when you start seeing that space between the knees, you lose some of the tilt.
Yeah, Tiger's an incredible model of this through the ball. His foot banks so well, and you can see how well that slides into position there.
Yeah. So again, what I would do with some of the kids is like, okay, we're going to move our linear. Right. There's the backing in.
Yeah.
And then it's this squeezing and extension piece.
Yeah.
Just to help them understand what it feels like to be able to do that, to glutes to get engaged.
Yeah.
So go ahead and give it a little zombie stretch walk.
So when I do this with the golf club,
For right now, we never do it with the golf club first. It's always like, can you do it first?
yeah.
And then what does it feel like? Yeah, you can feel the inners, you can feel your glutes.
Perfect. And just as a sensation with this front foot here, my pressure should be when I finish here on the outstep of my lead heel there.
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
And again, that would vary based on how much flair you have, how much range of motion you have.
And I can certainly feel my glutes are tucked.
Yeah.
Massively. So as I'm coming through and I'm pushing this in together, I feel that sort of explosive energy off the ground. Knees and legs feel very tight. Glutes feel tucked. Pelvis is forward. Chest is back.
Yeah.
It feels real strong.
Well, again, think of like Olympic. In the Olympics, those guys who are doing the discus, right?
Yeah.
And the hammer throws, they're all kind of sitting here. Nobody's turning in forward flexion. Nobody's spinning their back foot. I mean, there'd be no way for me to throw this really far. So it's an important piece to it, being able to tuck the pelvis, squeeze the glutes, right? So as the pelvis is starting to raise, and then some of it would, the side bend would come from the spine and the tilting in the pelvis, right? Because we've got to offset a little bit of the extension with some side bend.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to map out a little feel here from the address. So I've got my legs turned into the orientation which we've discussed before that would allow and facilitate this centered, rotated pivot, shifting and into this position here. That feels really good. I would say if you're ever going to do this, guys, just make sure that you are having some intent of hitting the ground with the golf club in your hand, and you're not just going, that feels great, because we still need to apply it to an actual golf shot. That feels really good. One more of those. Wonderful. So then, taking that away, one last feel. It's always odd after doing it with a training aid, and you can actually even just get this trail foot sliding.
And you can see it kind of moves back a little bit, a la Greg Norman, right, from Australia.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people do that, Rory. There's like some tiger videos that are doing the same exact thing.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll chuck one of those examples up on the screen here, but let's put that together. I'm going to hit a little punch shot here, focusing on that.
Beautiful.
I'll tell you what, that had more power than the first one. It was only a half shot.
Yeah.
Love it.
Love it, my friend. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the side bending, which is basically the banking of the foot. We're going to kind of use Cam Smith in this model here. So again, when we're kind of looking at this side bend, right, we would have the frontal piece. So this is just looking at it as kind of the ankle moving towards the ground, the inside part of your ankle, which would be more eversion, right? When it moves, the outside part of the ankle moves, that would be more inversion, right? There's a little bit of a change in the pitch of the ankle. Okay, so he's not really kind of moving where the inside part of that ankle is towards the ground. Okay, and then as he starts to kind of get to the top of the backswing, as he starts to come back down, you can see the lateral push. You can start to see how the ankle starts to move where the inside of the ankle is working towards the ground, working towards the ground, working towards the ground, and all of a sudden he's right there at like 5.5, and he already has a little bit more of that ankle. You just have to see it flipping, right? Where it starts to work closer and closer to the ground. There it is right there.
Yeah.
So then that helps, kind of a little bit of that banking in that I kind of talked about. Talked about the slide in the pelvis versus that guy who's over flexing the ankle, just spinning around without any kind of slide. All of a sudden you can see that, again, I think he has one of the best footworks. Tiger does too. I don't have Tiger in here, but it would be fun to have him in here. But I think Cam Smith has some great footwork, and you can see what starts to happen to that foot, and then it starts to roll upward.
Yeah.
Right? And even here you can start to see its movement. When we start to kind of look at this a little bit more from down the line, a lot of what you were doing, right, with those legs squeezing, making sure that if we kind of look at some of the body stuff, right there, you see the legs, see the ankles changing flex, kind of what we talked about, them regaining flex. There's a little bit of linear to the equation, and that's what really helps that ankle start to bank, and then it's not over flexing, then they start to straighten out quite a bit, and you can see that the spacing between the knees is pretty tight.
Yeah, big time.
So
no gaps.
That would be no gaps, or a small gap would be okay, right? But certainly no huge gap, and certainly no trail leg over flexing, which is an absolute killer as it relates to the pushing forward, right? Because there's no push from the ground, man. If that guy is really overactive in the flexing piece.